Hi, everybody, and welcome to our last lecture of the spring 2021 term. Congratulations on having made it this far. I hope you enjoyed this last lecture, and next week we're going to be doing something kind of different. As I said earlier this month when we first discussed New York 2140, I mentioned that it is part of the genre of hard science fiction. So science fiction that is supposed to be based on plausible scenarios rooted in science as we understand it now. The problem is that while the degree of global warming and sea level rise that this book envisions is kind of within the scope, I guess, of plausible futures, it is pretty far out there on the right tail of the statistical distribution. For the sake of dramatic effect and telling an interesting story, Kim Stanley Robinson chooses among the plausible scenarios a really, really extreme one. So for the most part, rather than a 50-foot sea level rise, about 15 meters by 2040, the scientific consensus is that we're probably more likely to see something between 3 and 15 feet, so 1 to 5 meters by that date, which is still pretty catastrophic. But not really at the point where all of lower Manhattan is flooded and looks like this. Okay, so it's a pretty extreme version of the future that he is presenting within a certain realm of plausibility, but not a very likely outcome. What's more, Robinson's novel imagines that New York has essentially done nothing to prepare for this. And while I think that felt like a somewhat plausible reality in the early 2010s when he likely began this project, a lot has actually changed over the last few years. According to an Architectural Digest article from last year, fewer than half of European cities have climate adaptation plans in place, and worldwide, only 18% of cities with populations of more than a million do. However, the trend is rising, and there really is a robust movement of architects and urban planners who see cities as the source of the solutions that are needed by the entire world. So, as a report by the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group begins, ending climate change begins in the city. And this is because urban density can actually create the possibility for a better quality of life, according to this report, and a lower carbon footprint through more efficient infrastructure and planning. So, in this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about how climate change is shaping the design philosophy of urbanists today around the world. But to do that, we first need to talk a little bit about how new urbanism in the US and the urban village movement in Europe arose in response to the problems with modernist urban planning, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So let's rewind back to 2 weeks ago and go back to those images we saw of Le Corbusier's contemporary city, which he designed in the 1920s, and which, like I said, does look kind of familiar in the sense that I think we have all seen apartment towers that kind of look like this, these giant towers surrounded by park, essentially, surrounded by green space. Um, but at the same time, it all looks a little bit alien. Like it's kind of strangely symmetrical and even, and no, like there's not a lot of real places on Earth that actually look like this. So this design philosophy was an effort to remedy what these modern urban planners and architects saw as the pathologies of pre-industrial cities, which they saw as irrationally built, inefficient in their use of space, and very excluding of nature. Also, quite unhealthy places for people to live. And this philosophy was highly influential in various parts of the world, especially during the rebuilding efforts after the Second World War, when many European cities had to essentially be rebuilt from the ground up. And as a result of the subsequent population boom, which produced a new demand for housing. So, in the latter half of the 20th century, however, flaws in modernist urban planning had kind of become apparent, leading to a movement of architects, engineers, and activists who sought to address them. So, one of the most prominent of these critics of modernist urban planning was Jane Jacobs, who, in a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, described how the theory's advanced like figures like Ebenezer Howard and Le Corbusier had hardened over the decades into something resembling a dogma or a new orthodoxy, and an orthodoxy that couldn't assimilate new evidence about wasn't working. about modern planned neighborhoods. By this point, we had many developments kind of built on this model. And Jacobs was arguing that the ways in which these were not working were not being taken into consideration by these planners. And because of this field's incuriosity about how cities actually function in the real world and their resistance to new evidence, Jacobs actually very quite, vividly compared them to the pseudoscience of bloodletting. She says that um, uh, she says that years of learning and a plethora of subtle and complicated dogma have arisen on a foundation of nonsense. So Jacob's book then proceeds to describe how various parts of a city function in real life based on her observations. And she stresses the importance of dense mixed use development and walkable streets to providing the safety, social vibrancy, and economic activity that make urban environments hospitable places for human beings. So now, if you go and read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which you should if you are interested in urbanism, because it's a very, very important book, but you will notice that in many, many ways, it doesn't really resemble what we today would expect of a work of social science. Um, Jacobs doesn't really define an explicit methodology. Most of her examples come directly from her own neighborhood in Greenwich Village, which is part of New York City, which is a very different sort of place than, say, London or Hong Kong. And she pulls additional testimony from friends and family members who live elsewhere. So while it's true that Jacobs made an important contribution by rooting her arguments in direct observation, kind of empirical method rather than theory, her approach is still highly anecdotal and unsystematic, and it's more a brilliant work of advocacy than a genuine work of scholarship. But Jacobs has nonetheless been tremendously influential. If you do research into new urbanism, she is cited absolutely everywhere. So she's kind of almost a required citation in a lot of these articles. And not only in the United States, but also in Canada and in Europe, where her writing heavily formed this urban village movement that sought to remedy the excesses of post war orthodox planning. So the parallel movement in the US is now known as New Urbanism, and New Urbanism has kind of come to stand globally for this particular set of aesthetic values and this particular style of development that we see absolutely everywhere. So before we kind of talk about what those features are, I need to kind of explain what major problems this new generation found with mid-century planning. Okay, so first and foremost, modernist urbanism, mid-century urbanism, tended to have an automobile-centric design. So these mid-century cities, this is a particular problem in the United States in its most extreme forms. This is a street in San Antonio, in my home state. Um, but we also see it elsewhere too. But these cities were designed to be accessed by car, and therefore they prioritize the needs of cars at the expense of pedestrians and at the expense of mass transit. So it's not unusual in an American city to have almost no mass transit or a very, very inadequate bus system at best. Okay, these are cities that are meant to be accessed by car. Furthermore, related to that is a lack of human scale in urban planning. So these auto-centric cities tend to be inaccessible to pedestrians and much less functional for people who are trying to navigate it on foot. So as you can see in this street, there's virtually no way to get from one side of the street to the other on foot, at least not safely. There's kind of a little bit of a sidewalk over there, but everything is spaced, because of the need for wide streets and parking lots, spaced in such a way that it's not very convenient to navigate this type of city on foot. Likewise, the neighborhood that I am sitting in right now is very reflective of this kind of mid-century city planning philosophy. So I am in a neighborhood that is gridded in 1 mile blocks and in which commercial areas, like for stores and restaurants, and the residential areas are very clearly divided. This is also a feature of single-use zoning, which I'll mention in a second. Which means that in order for me to get to the store or to go get a cup of coffee or to go pick up a sandwich or something like that, I have to walk about a mile. And this might not be so far, but it is hampered by the fact that there are, up until a couple of years ago, there were no sidewalks. And even though there's some sidewalks now, there's no easy way to cut directly through the neighborhood in order to reach the street where all of the stores and restaurants are. So the point is that my neighborhood is not really meant to be navigated on foot. It's maybe okay for kind of taking a little walk if you're not really trying to get somewhere. But if you want to actually go out and do the stuff that people need to do in their day, go grocery shopping, go to work, go pick up a cup of coffee, you really have to do it by car. So again, related somewhat to these same issues is the use of single-use zoning in modern cities. So single-use zoning is where different sections of the city are designated for particular purposes. So you have your business center, your industrial areas, and then your residential areas. And which means that in general, where you work and where you live can be quite far from one another. I think everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about here in Moscow. The problem with this is that it requires very significant commutes between home and work, lots of time spent in transit, and it also contributes to the extensive urban sprawl of many present day cities. Again, this is a major problem in Moscow. In addition, single use zoning also tends to create somewhat homogeneous and segregated communities. Remember that when I talked about Le Corbusier, I mentioned that he had kind of a hierarchical vision of the city and thought that basically everybody who shared a profession and a social class should kind of live alongside one another. Well, by some urban planners like Robert Moses in the United States, this also was implemented as an explicit philosophy. So certain kinds of areas were designated for certain kinds of housing. Some areas would have big single family homes, some areas would have apartment buildings, etc., which meant that people didn't have a lot of opportunity to live near and to encounter people who come from different backgrounds. And therefore, neighborhoods tend to be quite homogenous by design, not just by accident. So, New urbanism was therefore an attempt to kind of remedy these problems through several design principles. New urbanism are as follows. First is the idea that cities should be walkable. So while modern cities do need to accommodate automobiles, they shouldn't do so at the complete expense of pedestrians. A walkable city is built on human scale with short blocks that allow for maximum pedestrian penetration, so it's very easy to get around. And while there are examples of like entire towns and neighborhoods built from scratch on this model, kind of the purposeful redesign of downtown areas like, say, Kembergersky Pereoluk in the center of Moscow, these are also good examples of the walkable city concept implemented in an existing downtown area. Secondly, mixed use development. So as opposed to single use zoning, mixed use development is intended to bring offices, stores, residences, schools and hospitals and recreation areas all within an easy walkable distance of one another. The ideal is that you work and live in relatively close proximity, but in practice it doesn't always really work like that because many of us just by necessity have to commute to work or don't necessarily live near our work. Likewise, neighborhoods should contain a variety of housing options suited to different ages and income levels. So you should have places to live that appeal to families, that appeal to young professionals, that appeal to retired people. And it should be possible for people from different social backgrounds to live in close proximity to one another. So you should have different types of developments where people from professional backgrounds, but also, say, blue collar workers can live in the same neighborhood. Again, this is a nice idea that doesn't always happen in practice. And finally, another major principle of new urbanism is transit-oriented development. So in order to relieve congestion within a city and to further reduce the need for private vehicles, neighborhoods should be designed to give easy access to public transportation. So built around subway systems and around bus lines and that kind of thing. So as I said in the previous lecture, every utopia is a dystopia for someone else. And the same, of course, can be said of new urbanism. So some view it as essentially kind of a failed project, noting that many of the urbanist developments have failed to achieve the goals that they set for themselves. And this is especially true on the diversity front. So a new geography article on Canadian new urbanist developments notes that they serve affluent ownership households, creating exclusive new communities by means of price, just as previous ones did. So the idea here is that new urbanism and these new urbanist developments have really just become kind of playgrounds for rich people or for tourists in the case of some cities, and they aren't really enjoyed by the people that they are supposed to benefit. Elsewhere, new urbanism has basically become synonymous with gentrification and the displacement of poor people as wealthier people move into redeveloped areas. So, new urbanism is so ubiquitous and so mainstream at this point that in 2017, an urban planner named Natalie Delgadillo argued that new urbanism was kind of functionally dead as a movement, that it had become so hegemonic and so mainstream as to no longer require like something called a movement. She says that 30 years ago this month, when I first started writing for this magazine, the idea of a column on the growing trend towards urbanism would have been laughable. Sure, some downtowns and old industrial districts were showing signs of life, and the first loft conversions were taking place, but generally speaking, downtowns were 9 to 5 office districts, and urban was often a code word for ghetto. She says, what a difference 3 decades makes. Today, Governing's readers can't get enough about cities, urban life, new transit lines, and kids making zillions of dollars writing code on laptops and coffee shops. It's a world I hardly could have imagined back in 1987. So whereas back in the 80s, the city was a place where people worked and where maybe some poor people lived, but not people who could afford to go live in the suburbs. Today, everything is about urbanism. There's lots of redevelopment and lots of new stuff happening in central cities, and so we don't really need anybody advocating it, is kind of the argument here. New urbanists themselves have kind of pushed back against this characterization and have specifically suggested that the exigencies of climate change and the possibilities of urbanism in combating climate change make advocacy for their principles ever more urgent. So, for instance, there's a prominent architect and new urbanist named Peter Calthorpe, who argues that urbanism is the most cost-effective solution to climate change, more so than most renewable technologies. And he also says that urbanism's many collateral benefits, economic, social, and environmental, enhance its desirability and economics. In short, urbanism is the foundation for a low-carbon future and is our least cost option. So in short, new urbanists are promising that the goals of revitalizing urban centers and combating and adapting to climate change go hand in hand. I'm saying that as creating denser, more walkable cities is essential to reducing dependency on the internal combustion engine and using land more efficiently and ecologically. So, as such, you see a lot of new urbanist principles adopted in the climate adaptation plans of some major cities, which themselves kind of envision these utopian cities of the future that are both healthier, because there's less pollution, and more in harmony with nature. So, a good example is this design for the waterfront in Boston by the landscape architecture firm Scape. The plan here is to basically take Boston's 47-mile waterfront, which is right next to the Atlantic Ocean, and to basically make this waterfront, a series of walkable parks. Okay, so the goal is to increase access and open space, they say, along the waterfront while better protecting the city during a major flooding event. So the idea is that these parks will create not only space for Bostonians to enjoy, but that they will also serve as a buffer and a barrier against potential flooding events. And given that, like Boston, so many cities are coastal and therefore threatened by sea level rise, we're seeing a lot of designs that really try to reimagine the relationship between urban space and nature, and especially the urban space and water. If you want to see examples of kind of green architecture, if you're at Skolkova, just walk over to the disc building because we've got some examples of it there, of trying to incorporate the idea of nature into architecture. It's right there in the interior of the disc building. So other examples are, for example, Lagos, Nigeria. So Lagos is expected to see nearly a meter of sea level rise by 2100 if global warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. And because Lagos is the largest city in Africa and the real economic powerhouse of the region, it can't really be abandoned altogether. Kind of the theory of sunk costs, or the principle of sunk costs, kind of applies here as it does in New York. So recent designers have started conjuring all kinds of concepts for floating architecture, such as Kunle Adeyemi's design for a floating school and kind of this larger water-based community that could be kind of navigated using these raised pathways. This school was actually built in Lagos, and quite sadly, it collapsed shortly after being built. The project was also caught up in local politics in some really unfortunate ways, but was nevertheless kind of a very beautiful concept and a beautiful design. Another good example of this kind of work is the work of Kashif Chowdhury in Bangladesh. He designed this friendship center in Gaibandha, which uses a mix of modern and traditional Bengali designs and follows the principles of walkability and human scale architecture. And also, like where the built environment is directly interacts with water. Okay, so where it has the feeling of like a brick structure kind of built on top of a lagoon. So in short, while New York of Robinson's novel has to kind of adapt to a new relationship with the sea and with nature in the context of crisis because they were not prepared for it, we do actually see many examples in the world of cities that are already planning ahead for some version of that reality and trying to envision kind of a new relationship between urban space and nature. And so that's really what I want to talk about in our online discussion this week. I look forward to seeing what you have to say.